Thanks for being here. I'm Ed Eaton talking with Amy Donaldson. She is the host of The Letter, the number one podcast last I checked, at least on the iTunes or Apple Podcasts.
We did get bumped in the accuracy journalism. We are journalists at the end of the day, right?
Yes, that's right. But
Yeah, we got bumped. I don't know if you noticed that kind of the podcast that got us all excited about podcasting, Serial, the subject of their first season, Adnan Syed, he was released from prison after 20 plus years. And
yeah.
so I think there were three podcasts, including Serial, that talked about that, and all three of them bumped us. So yeah, but we're still, I think we're at last I looked, we were still in the top 10, I think five or six. But honestly, it's exceeded my expectations. And what Cy Snarr, the mom of the man who was murdered, and I, when we first started talking about this, like we're just blown away by the the reception that the podcast has had.
So let's go back to that. And I told Amy off air, I'll say it now. I've been at the dentist, so I might sound a little different for those of you watching. My mouth is coming out of the numbness.
Mhm.
You mentioned Sky. Let's go back to the beginning. How did you first find out about this story, Amy?
Well, I'll tell you that story because that's why it's called The Letter. The Letter was always the working title, and it was because I received a friend of mine. You probably know the Ragnar relay races. One of the founders of that series is named Tanner Bell, and he's a friend of mine. I've been covering them since they were youngsters, starting that race. And he reached out to me and said, "Hey, you've got to read this letter my aunt wrote about an experience she had, and I think it would make a great podcast." And you have probably had the same experience where people say this would be a great story for you, and then it's not so much. But I read her letter and I was in tears. I mean, I was actually like sobbing. And I was like, I need to know what happened. I need to know the rest of the story. And that letter is not even in this podcast.
Really?
But what ends up happening is she, just in a weird twist of fate, her parents served a mission in New York City, and they taught the killer's mother, and so they knew the family. And there's all these weird connections, but I kind of came into the story at that entry point. So I knew what had happened in 1996, when two 18-year-old kids up taking pictures at Little Dell Reservoir were shot for what we thought was no apparent reason. In the media, it was really jarring because it's 1996. It's before Columbine, before you have random shootings all the time. And there wasn't a good reason. We look for why these things happen. We try to make sense of things that don't make sense. And it was very unnerving for most people in the community because there wasn't any way to feel better about what happened, right? There was no way to say like, oh, this is why, or this is the explanation. And it was really tough. And so the young man, 19-year-old kid, shot two 18-year-olds, killed the boy. The woman lived. She's now a prosecutor in Salt Lake County here. And so the story really became, I just called them up after I, got up the courage to call and say, "Hey, I feel like I've eavesdropped on your lives, but can I know what happened?" And just basically started interviewing people. Wasn't sure. I was actually working at the Deseret News at the time as a print reporter. That's been my career for the last 28 years. And then I started podcasting in 2016, and I went to Cheryl, who's my boss now, and said, "Hey, what do you think of this idea?" And she was like me, crying and like, "Oh my gosh, I need you to find out what happened." Right.
Mm.
So that was really how it started, was just our own curiosity. This, like, how does this happen? And that'll come, you'll understand in much more detail in episode 7. And I'm sorry to make you wait, but one of the reasons I did that was because I felt like people needed to understand what it had been like to live for 20 plus years with the shadow of this really horrific incident every single day.
And you've also lived with it 20 plus years if you covered it back in the mid 90s. I
Yeah.
mean, and I listened to the bonus episode you dropped, I think a few weeks ago, where you said you had to find out for yourself, regardless of whether or not there was a podcast or a story. You wanted to know personally.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and you've probably had this experience as well as a journalist, especially covering crime and corrections. You feel like you get to see things through if you follow it in the courts and maybe someone gets sentenced. And I covered corrections, so I did parole hearings, and I saw sort of the middle to tail end of some. But I think what I kind of realized was that we do a really great job of covering breaking news, things as they happen, but we don't always kind of bring you this context, this long tail. And what happened was I was talking to Yvette, Yvette Rodier survived the shooting. When I did an interview with her, there had just been a pretty high profile mass shooting. And we just started talking about sort of how when she was a victim of this, she wouldn't want to go to the grocery store or to church because she was scared. And people could say to her, like, that's silly. Like, it's church, it's school, it's safe. And now her fear of not being safe anywhere is our fear of not being safe anywhere, right? And so I just started wondering if there's probably a lot of people out there living with some kind of trauma, with some kind of loss, and maybe we could kind of collectively process this through this one experience. And honestly, that was even before COVID, and where we've now had this, I feel like it's a collective trauma. You know, even if you didn't lose anyone, people lost businesses, they lost years of their, like, I didn't get to see my two youngest grandkids for like 9 months, you know. I mean, it's my granddaughter didn't get kindergarten. She didn't, we just lost things, and there's no way to get them back. And we haven't really figured out how to make room for grieving that, because we're like, oh, you just gotta keep going, gotta keep plowing through. And so this idea of grief sort of really became a driving factor. And then, you know, later on in the podcast, you know, in as we were making it, forgiveness really came. Like, what is forgiveness? Like, we think we know what it is, but do we? And can you forgive without ever having a conversation with someone? Like, what does that look like? And so, and like, I think just this idea of like how we expect people who've suffered tragedy to get over it, to find closure, you know, to bring their sadness, their broken heart to some finality. And the reality is grief is love. And so if you love someone, you're going to grieve them forever. Like, as long as you're alive, you're going to feel that pain, that loss. And I think we probably, if ever there were a time where we needed to talk about that more universally and more collectively, that it's now.
Yeah, a lot of these true crime podcasts aren't very uplifting. There's not a lot of redemption there. It's gritty, and people love that stuff. I'm not downplaying it, but this one's different in the fact that, you know, there is more to the story. I purposely have not Googled anything about it or asked anyone about it, but I do want to know if you can say, if you interview George, is George even still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive. And I did reach out to him, and you will hear from George in episode 8. So,
okay.
Yeah.
How many episodes are there?
Right now there are 8, but there will likely be a 9th. So, yeah, so we'll probably make another episode, but some of it depends on what happens. I mean, the problem is that, like, life doesn't end. Like, there's no finish line. We all think like this is the end of the story. Well, but people keep living, and things keep evolving, and people keep changing, and relationships change. And so I think that it's probably never going to be done. Like, I don't know how far I will follow it, but I definitely think I want to follow the threads that we have weaved together for this podcast. I want to follow those as long as I possibly can. Because I mean, it's 3.5 years of my life now. So, but yeah, I think that I thought it was important to reach out to George, whether he wanted to participate or not. He didn't want to be interviewed, but we exchanged letters, and I have his permission to share. I had his permission to share those, and he was supportive of the podcast. He was supportive of you know, what we were doing. It's difficult in prison. People don't understand. I covered corrections for 6 years, so I do understand that there's no good publicity in prison. That anytime your case gets covered, you will suffer in prison. And so most guys are pretty reluctant, unless they're kind of high up the food chain. You know, they're really reluctant to talk to reporters with attribution. It's difficult. It's a really difficult place to report on, to get stories from that are meaningful and that regular people can relate to, because it's such a toxic culture. And which is, again, knowing that environment, I was like, how did this happen? How did how did he get to the point where he even wanted to, have anything to do with reaching out to the victims? Like most people I know, when I covered the prison system, didn't even want to look at their victims when they were in court, right? So there's so many, and I think that one of the things I've learned from this is how we're not really separated by very much. Like your experiences feel really unique and different from my experiences when we look at them from, the 800-foot view. But when you get up close, you realize how much your one decision took you that direction and my decision took me the other direction, right? So like there's these little diverging decisions that we make that take us to a different life. And that's one of the things I really wanted to examine was like the small things and the small comforts and the small miracles and the ways in which people are heroic, but we never talk about.
So you began working on the actual podcast 3.5 years ago?
Yeah. So I got the tip 3.5 years ago. And then I think I reached out to Cy maybe 3 or 4 months after that. And I did my first interview with her in this very technical studio I've built in my house.
Yeah.
My son's old bedroom. I interviewed her here in the spring of 2019.
Wow.
And we did like a 2-hour interview. And at the time we were like, we don't know what we're doing. Maybe it's a story for the newspaper. Maybe it's a book. Maybe it's a podcast. I leaned always to podcast. I have wanted to tell a story in a narrative style in podcasting. I've done interview style, doing sports talk radio style, and then, kind of political banter shows. I enjoyed them a lot, but what I really love is storytelling. And so I thought maybe we could do a journalism, story, but tell it in a narrative form, use some of that fiction tools to tell the story. And it was a lot harder than I expected. Not gonna lie, because as a journalist, you're writing to answer questions.
Yeah.
I had not considered, how do I keep you interested in a story? How much do I give you? And I really did feel, and you've listened to the first episode, I felt like it was so hard to ask people to go where the Snarrs and Yvette Rodier where they have traveled, that I felt like I needed to give everyone some hope right from the get-go. That you're not just going to suffer. This isn't just a story about that's sad and about loss and about, missed opportunities and tragedies, which is a lot of crime stories. But it's also a story about how people survive, how people rebuild, how people are resilient, and honestly, how people are heroic.
Yeah.
And I have joked about it. I covered high school sports for 20 years. So I always say my job is my religion. I love, because the kids are so inspiring, right? They do these amazing. And so that's how I felt like working on this podcast. Every time I worked on it, it felt like I wanted to be a better person to be able to be worthy of telling the story, because the people involved they're so generous and they're generous with each other.
I really liked when you said that in the bonus episode about your job being your religion. It's something that I can relate to. You want it, it fulfills you, it feels good.
Yeah.
And during depressing, dark days, there's always the next story, or there's always something coming up that instantly can boost you or help you get to in a better mental state. Mm-hmm. So you said you didn't think it would be as big as it has been, the success at least. The day that it dropped, were you nervous? Were you, what were you expecting?
So, that's a good question, because I haven't really had time to sit and examine every aspect of this experience. But I remember my boss saying, you'll feel differently after this. And all I could think about was all the stuff on my to-do list, right? Like, I have anxiety, so I've been trying to do to-do lists at night and to-do lists in the morning, and it still doesn't help 50% of the time. And that week for me, my anxiety was off the charts, because, as you know, when someone trusts you with their story, like, that's anxiety inducing anyway. But also in this case, I was so worried that I had been given this fragile, amazing miracle. And I just didn't want to squish it. I didn't want to ruin it. And so We talked a lot about that throughout the podcast, about honoring each person's experience. Like, as you know, from listening to episode 2, Yvette does not say the shooter's name. Yeah. She started right after the shooting, and she never says his name. So in episode 2 and episode 6, which deal with her experience exclusively, I didn't use his name. And I did that so that if she wanted to listen, I was respecting her boundary that she had put up. So there were all these little ways in which we were trying to be as respectful as you can. But at the end of the day, you're still taking someone's tragic heartbreak and turning it into journalism / entertainment, right? You know, I feel like people who didn't step into the limelight on purpose, that they didn't do it on their own, that life circumstances shoved them out there. Mm-hmm. I feel like I owe them some more consideration, much more consideration than I owe somebody who runs for office or who takes on the mantle of power on their own. And so, yeah, I will say the first week I was off the charts, anxious, couldn't sleep. Didn't care about rankings. I had people in our office who were concerned about, like, I wanted people to hear the story. Yeah. I wanted people to feel and have the experience that I had and that our team had with the story. And that was my fear, was that, you know, in journalism, you try some things, some work, some don't. I was like, oh, please don't let this be one of them that doesn't work. Yeah. But yeah, I remember Sai asking me maybe like a year in, she actually said she didn't want to do the podcast and then she changed her mind. But she said, I mean, do you think anyone's even going to care? I mean, like, who are we? And I said, all I know is that I care. And I think the world needs to hear this story. I think we need this. I need this. And so, you know, maybe it was just driven by that selfish, like, I need to have, everyone used to always ask me, like, how do you decide what stories to write? Because as you know, there's plenty of stories you pass on. But for me, it was always, what do I want to read? What do I want to be inspired? I want to be educated. I want to know things, but I also want a reason to be better. And honestly, the most rewarding aspect of this is the emails and the texts I've gotten from people in my life who are, I can't talk to you about this right now because I'm still processing it, but this is an answer to my prayers. Like, I needed to hear what this person says in the podcast or that person says in the podcast. And so I think whatever is there, it is speaking to some of us in some way. And that's really rewarding. What I love about podcasting is it creates a community. And I love this idea that we could all process whatever it is we're processing together. And my hope is that as this progresses, we created a feedback line so people can call in and share their experiences, because I do think there's this collective grief hanging over us. And some of it's because of COVID, and some of it's just because of what people are living with. And we're not very good at grief, and we're not very good at talking about these difficult things. If someone says, oh, I'm having a terrible day, we kind of run the other direction because we don't want to get sucked into that depressing mess, right? So I feel like this is an opportunity to really know each other. And so I've been having some of those conversations with random people, and some of them are people I've known from work, but I didn't know I didn't know their lives. I didn't know their pain. I didn't know their struggles.
Well, it's called The Letter. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. It's a great listen. 4 episodes have already been released, and then there's at least 4 more, Amy says, over the next 4 weeks, I'm assuming.
Yep. Every Tuesday, there'll be a new episode.
Every Tuesday. And it's great. Even if you're not really into the true crime genre type of thing, this isn't your typical true crime story. And if you are into true crime, this is your type of story. So it fits for everybody.
Yeah, I will say we kind of resisted the true crime label because I have covered crime, and I really had heartburn about it's not a whodunit. We know who did it. Yep. It's not looking at the criminal justice system in any depth, right? We talk about it, but that's not the reason for the podcast. The podcast is really about what happens to people when something terrible happens and high profile, and how do we dismantle that, and how do we rebuild our lives?
Great. Amy, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the series.
Thank you so much for having me.